So today I want to talk about Spycraft and Statecraft, the article published in Foreign Affairs on January 30th, 2024 by William J. Burns, who during the Biden administration was director of the CIA. I think it's a very neat window into how the CIA was understanding the world at that moment. Of course, a lot has changed in the first month of the new administration that took over in the U.S. So the article is free and it's not behind a paywall, but I will link to it below. But just to make it easier to highlight certain things, I just copied the text and put it in a Word file. So we're going to head over there and talk about it now. Like I said, there was a lot of things in this article that caught my attention, and I think it's just easier if I'm able to highlight them and make them bold in Word. So I think the opening sentence is really almost poetic, and I thought, wow, that's really cool. I really appreciate people that can write well, and so I thought this was a really cool way to begin the article. So without more preamble, right, let's just jump into it. So for as long as countries have kept secrets from one another, they have tried to steal them from one another. Espionage has been and will remain an integral part of statecraft, even as its techniques continually evolve. So already there, right? I mean, basically it's saying, it's part of history, right? We've been spying on each other since the dawn of man, and we continue to do so today, and we will continue to do so into the future. It's just what humans do for whatever reason, right? I don't know. Sometimes you got to wonder, like, is it the reason that humans don't work together to just live in peace and harmony because it's just too boring? I mean, as awful as I might sound, and I'm glossing over conflicts, that's not what I'm trying to say. I'm just saying, why is it that it's so easy to work against each other rather than just to work with each other? I don't fully understand that, but again, I'm not a spy, I'm not a politician, so I guess I don't see it that way. Anyway, editorializing notwithstanding, there's a lot of things that I do recommend. First off, I recommend anybody just to read this article. There's some pearls of wisdom in here, and again, windows into the world. And so one of the things that caught my attention was right off the bat, the United States no longer enjoys uncontested primacy, and in which existential climate threats are mounting. Complicating matters further is a revolution in technology even more sweeping than the Industrial Revolution or the beginning of the nuclear age. And of course, he's talking about artificial intelligence and quantum computing. He names them outright below, or throughout the article. And so three things right off the bat that are, no matter what you think, no matter what you believe, no matter who you think is actually responsible for it, the U.S. is no longer uncontested in its hegemony, right? So that's an issue, right? Because that rearranges how the world works, and we're clearly seeing that now with this new administration in the U.S. And existential climate threats, that's more or less where I work, my research, right? Everything having to do with the mitigation and adaptation to climate change. It's a reality. Think what you want. You're arguing against physics, as I've said in other videos, and the CIA views it very much that way. And that also rearranges how the world works, because a lot of the reasons we do what we do is because natural, for example, waterways, right? Trade routes in the Arctic are opening up. That was not possible before. It is possible now, and it has become the latest battleground between Russia on the one hand and the U.S. on the other. And so yeah, it's just a fact. The CIA does view climate change as real, and it's complicating geopolitical matters even more. And of course, technology, which, yeah, as far as I understand it, a lot of AI models do a lot of things that most of their creators don't understand fully. And then the question becomes, well, if you don't understand what it's actually doing, the technology itself, I mean, how can you regulate it, right? To try and mitigate the unintended consequences. So that's like an ongoing thing. And in this context, or against this backdrop, I should say, equipping analysts with sophisticated artificial intelligence models that can digest mammoth amounts of open source and clandestinely acquired information so that they can make their best human judgments. So there's a lot of information out there now. So as long as you log on the internet, there is some trace of you somewhere. If you walk around, and the article does say that outright, in any of the most cities, really, it doesn't really matter what country you're in. There are cameras, so somebody has a picture of your face somewhere, and there's increasingly better facial recognition softwares out there, so anybody can trace anybody on this planet, pretty much. I mean, it's unless you live somewhere in the desert where there's absolutely no technology or completely off the grid, somebody somewhere knows something about you, right? It's just a reality. So it is what it is. And so at the same time, what the CIA does with intelligence it gathers is also changing. Strategic declassification, the international public disclosure of certain secrets undercut rivals and rally allies, has become an even more powerful tool for policymakers. So that one was interesting. So strategic declassification, as the name implies, so things are released. When they are released, to the extent that they are released, is there a bias when this information comes out? These are things to think about, right? The next time we see like a document dump of some kind, like for example, the Panama Papers, the Pandora Papers, and more recently the JFK files, right? The things to think about. So he goes on to say that the CIA is taking on like the role of intelligence diplomacy, which I thought was interesting. I've never actually heard about that before until I read this article. So that's interesting. So I say, kind of implying that the CIA is also engaged not only in spycraft, but also kind of diplomacy. Diplomacy not in the sense that they're doing it behind the government's back, rather they more or less are the front line in how they engage, I guess, their counterparts around the world to try to, that is actually set out right in the article, avoid misunderstandings and confusion between countries. And he goes on to recognize that the only thing that's changing, or the only thing guaranteed into the future, is that change will accelerate, which is scary, right? We can't even catch our breath when something has happened, and then we can only expect things to just pick up pace, right? So obviously he was going to talk about Ukraine. So the post-Cold War era came to a definitive end the moment Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. I'm not going to lie, I also believed, I didn't have any other information. I thought that the Russian military was going to be better than it was, conventionally anyway. And so he talks about their inflated military prowess and the fact that strategically they are on the road to become China's economic vassal. And he believes anyway that NATO grew larger and stronger. Now this is, I've heard other experts more or less discuss something to the opposite of this. And the new administration, and we'll check that out, Pete Hegseth, who is the Secretary of Defense, right, for the U.S., his speech to NATO, and we'll talk about that in a future video. What the Russians did eventually led to some internal problems. So you all remember when Yevgeny Prigozhin, the man in charge of the Wagner Group, basically led a coup d'état that failed, right? And then eventually he was he passed away in a plane accident, right? Wink, wink. So again, if things don't go as Putin thought, or President Putin, I should say, he might engage in nuclear radio saber rattling. So we'll talk about that in a future video. But of course, it was a little bit dicey there when they tried out the Oreshnik missile back in November 2024. That was a very complicated time, yeah. So if we will dive into that in a future video for sure. But for those of you that don't know, I definitely recommend you you read up on that, because it was a scary time on planet Earth. So the CIA is not dismissing these threats, but at the same time they're not being intimidated by them. The all total aid that the U.S. has given to the Ukrainians at least at that point was about 5% of the U.S. defense budget. Of course, there's the other economic player, or the other geopolitical player, I should say. China remains the only U.S. rival with both the intent to reshape the international order and the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do so. And that's becoming very obvious. That should be fundamentally obvious to anybody mildly paying attention to the world. In the intelligence profession, we study carefully what leaders say, but we pay even more attention to what they do. And that's just kind of like the old adage, right? Humans are what they do, not what they say. People paint, magical stories about themselves or their acumen and prowess, but what they actually do, the social proof that they actually have, sometimes, more often than that, I should actually say, doesn't actually back that up, right? So he also goes on to recognize in this article that the United States absorbed some economic pain to counter the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it's a recognition of what was going on, right? And he goes on to say that one of the surest ways to rekindle Chinese perceptions of American fecklessness and stoke Chinese aggressiveness would be to abandon support for Ukraine. And the reason I highlighted this was because my impression is, and please do comment down below on what do you guys think, is that the American administration, the current one anyway, is going to walk away from the Ukraine conflict. Now, whether that actually happens or it's just a threat, we can only time will tell. But at the time of the recording of this video, it seems like that's where we're headed, right? So he recognizes that competition with China is taking place against the backdrop of thick economic interdependence and commercial ties between it and the United States. The reason I also highlighted this was because, again, at the time of this recording, the U.S. put sweeping tariffs on all Chinese imports, and basically the U.S. is heading for a decoupling with China, right? It's pretty obvious as well. Trade is way down, and only time will tell what the consequences of that will be. And if the past is precedent, Washington ought to be attentive to rivalries between growing number of middle powers, which have historically helped spark collisions between major ones. And so, of course, the most obvious example is the geopolitical competition between and proxy war, basically between Iran and Israel, right? And that's pretty obvious as well. That at the time of this recording of this video as well, tensions are very high, and hopefully negotiations for peace will prevail, but who knows, right? He goes on to say that he spent much of the last 4 decades working in and on the Middle East, and he's rarely seen it this tangled up and explosive. Of course, we saw how quickly the government in Syria was overthrown, but it's not like Boy Scouts overtook that government and are now running the country, right? It's very read up on it. We'll probably get to it in another video. Something like else that really caught my attention was meanwhile dissatisfaction with the war. Oh, he's talking here about what's going on inside of Russia is continuing to gnaw away at the Russian leadership and the Russian people beneath the thick surface of state propaganda and repression. The undercurrent of dissatisfaction is creating a once-in-a-generation recruiting opportunity for the CIA, and they are not letting it go to waste. So obviously, of course, yeah, I mean, I'd be surprised if they weren't able to recruit spies now. There's always going to be people that do not agree with the government in which they live in and will go the route of turning spy, right? It's just, yeah, it's been like a fact since the beginning of time, right? It is what it is. So one thing that really caught my attention, and it's really, you can extrapolate this to pretty much any domain in which we humans work in, is that priorities aren't real unless budgets reflect them. And so in my world, which is climate change and adapting to it and mitigating it, realistically, like there's so many plans to deal with climate change. What there isn't are financial resources with which to get there, right? And so if governments just announce things that they're going to do, but there is no actual movement of resources with which to accomplish these goals, it's just talk. And so I thought this was such an important point to highlight. Priorities are not real unless budgets reflect them. And that goes from our individual lives to entire societies, right? And so he goes on to recognize that in 2021, they set up a new mission center focused exclusively on China. If I'm honest, the only thing that surprises me about this is not that it exists. It took so long to set one up. Because I remember when I was a kid, even then they were talking about, China's rise, right? And I'm talking, this is the early 2000s when I was like a teenager, right? So, yeah. Obviously they can't, so Russia and China are obviously geopolitical competitors, or I wouldn't say Russia for sure, no, but China definitely near peer competitor. But they can't forget about past ghosts, right? They're also keeping an eye on that. They're also keeping an eye on North Korea, for example, things in the South China Sea, and countries in Latin America and Africa. And so He's talking about this, like I said, the cameras and the facial recognition, which is interesting. This was very fascinating to me. Like, conspiracy level, conspiracy theory, or just paranoid, I guess, level confessions, where it says, or he says, the agency has developed warehouses worth of spy gadgetry over the years, and his favorite is the Cold War camera designed to look like a dragonfly. So the next time you see an insect within your office and you're somebody important at a company or something, just keep in mind that maybe it's somebody spying on you, right? And then he talks about the artificial intelligence, open source information, of course. There's a bunch of stuff out there now, like satellite imagery and, like I said, video caught on camera and stuff. All of this can be mined, and all kinds of information can be gleaned from it for sure. And yeah, he then talks about like non-state actors, of course, what happened, countries where their population, it's just like a tinderbox, and that they need economic revival. Otherwise, nefarious actors can perhaps take over and create havoc for the region and within their own populations, of course. And then just goes on to recognize that, yeah, they've kind of made conditions better for spies, kind of remembering that, though people are spies and stuff, they are human, right? So they have families and they have health issues too. So he kind of talks about that at the end. But nonetheless, I recommend this article, and yeah, let me know what you guys think. But overall, I just thought it was a very neat article that gives at least a window into the world at the time he was head of the CIA. Of course, after he left, so much has changed within not even the first 100 days of the new administration that took over in 2025 in the U.S. So with that, yeah, let's keep the conversation going.